And Chef Trevor is here, and although we're going to cook a little bit later, there's an important conversation we want to share with you first. And Trev, we turned you from guest expert to host for a roundtable discussion with a couple of your favorite chefs to talk about Asian restaurants and how the community is doing during this time. And it's been a tough time.
Yeah, Tracy, it's been a really tough time. And I think a lot of times what we forget about is when we talk about the term Asia or Asian, we don't actually ingest the fact that there's actually 49 countries that compose all of Asia. And a lot of times, not only people, but cuisine and history gets lumped up, particularly this last year with the culture of Chinese. So I had an opportunity to sit down with two amazing chefs in the city of Toronto. Chef Nuit regular, she is the chef and co-owner of Pai, Sabai Sabai, Kin, and Sukhothai, and also a cookbook author. And really, if there's anything about the essence of being Thai and cooking Thai, it's Chef Nuit. And then Chef Eva Chin, who is by way of Hawaiian, Samoan, Singaporean, Chinese, went to Vancouver and now is in Toronto, and she's the chef de cuisine of Cuisine by Momofuku. And we had a wonderful discussion about all these things.
Oh my God, fantastic restaurant, so incredible chefs. The jumping off point for your discussion with these incredible chefs was this question. If we learn about cultures by their food, what does it say when yours is thought of as fast food or not valued the same as others? Let's take a look at the conversation you had.
Does North American culture think of the words cheap and fast a lot of times jump to the top of the list when we think of Asian cuisine?
First and foremost, this definitely comes from how history began. When the Transcontinental Railroad started, the very first Chinese restaurants were built for the Chinese laborers. It was comfort food for them to be away from home. Their wages were 2/3 less of their fellow Caucasian laborers. And so restaurant owners had to sell the food cheap and fast in order for the Chinese laborer to finish eating and go back to work, and so that they can afford it as well. This didn't change, and that became such a solid perception from the beginning of time. And it was something that I don't think any Chinese restaurant was able to break free from.
When are we going to get over this hump where pad Thai is the only Thai dish, and California rolls and teriyaki is the only thing Japanese, and spring rolls and chop suey is the only thing that's Chinese?
Sometimes the perception of pad Thai is quite different as well. I remember when I first opened the restaurant 2008, I have a call from one of the customers and said, "You don't know how to cook Thai food. You don't know how to cook pad Thai." And I was shocked and troubled with that, because the way that they see pad Thai differently here in Western world, that my pad Thai doesn't have ketchup, and therefore the pad Thai that they cook is not pad Thai. And for that, I realized that the way that we grow up and cook and the way that we eat back home in Thailand, different experience here in Western world, and the way that they see pad Thai here.
The impact of COVID as it is on our industry alone has been devastating. We've had a real shift in sentiment towards Asian businesses in general, and the stigmatism. What have been your challenges and strategies this last year?
I think late February, early March, just around the peak of that time before it all exploded out in Ontario, people were already starting to slow down on eating out and just stepping out of their homes in general. And people were phoning into Cuisine or Momofuku Toronto in general, and they were phoning in and they're like, I just want to double check, there's no COVID, right? Because you guys are an Asian restaurant. And it's just, it's as ridiculous as that has begun before the lockdown even started.
Some of my staff would say, "Hey, you know what? Let's just come to work early, so then I don't have to run into many people, or maybe stay a little bit later. Then I can go home. That not so many people will look at me that way." The mental problem in my team, it's number one thing that I see, because that we have to cut so many of our staff as well because of the demand and supply that's not like before. We have a huge restaurant that now serve only take out. It's become the ratio of our space and our kitchen, it doesn't help with the business.
Now, this is brutal, Trev. So not only does the restaurant industry have to deal with COVID and having to pivot and having to figure out what to do with employees, these Asian restaurants are having people call in and say, by the way, you sure you don't have COVID there? So you're dealing with the racism, the xenophobia, the fact that there's an economic crisis right now. This is a lot. And I really appreciate you going into host mode and having this conversation. Now, we wanted to talk a little bit about the cost disparity when it comes to restaurants and really break it down for people. So, Trev, you've got a bit of a lesson for us.
Yeah, this is something that we actually don't talk a lot about, but it's actually been ingrained in our system, particularly in Western society for generations on generations, is the difficulty that ethnic restaurants actually have in yielding their ingredients in order to make the same amount of money as, let's say, continental style restaurants. We did a simple comparison at looking at something like the simplicity of an entire whole duck. I have two dishes here. On my right is a very classic French dish, which we call a duck confit, which is a classic dish you get in most French restaurants, something that I love, something that generally my wife will order if we hit a French bistro. On my left here is a very classic Cantonese roasted duck. Now, here's the thing. Most people would not think, because of the nature of what we call cheap, ugly, delicious ethnic food, that perhaps Chinese restaurants, particularly in the Toronto area, the majority of their duck is purchased from a locally run organic duck farm, the same duck where this continental restaurant gets its duck from. Most people don't know that. So the price of the entire raw duck is essentially the same, about $12, $13. But if you take a look at this dish, okay, a classic French dish, that took about 4.5 hours from prep until cook to finish, and is about 8 to 9 ingredients on the duck alone. Here's this dish. I would say on average in a French bistro, this dish will go for anywhere between $26 and $35, and it's just a duck leg. So the yield on this is probably 18 to 20% of the entire duck. Now we have this, a very classic Chinese barbecue duck that you see hanging in the Chinese barbecue shops. Number one, the skill of Chinese barbecue is a very specific skill that you need to be trained for. This dish takes about 8 hours to make and has about 14 to 15 ingredients and a skilled trade. This duck, the entire thing, which is 100% yield as opposed to 20% yield, this is probably anywhere from $16 to $24 you can pay for it. I paid $25 for this entire duck. So in a razor-thin margin industry, based on how we view food, because of the cost and what we depict food to be cheap and delicious and ugly, ethnic food a lot of times doesn't have the opportunity to price things the way it should be based on how it's cooked and prepared. So there's a big disparity in that as well that we don't talk about.
Really interesting, and I wonder how that, and you shouldn't have the answers to this, obviously, the industry should, but how do we combat that? How do we get away from that stereotype so that you're actually paying the right price for the food that you're eating and not getting caught up in this idea that you're eating something cheap and fast? Any ideas?
Listen, Tracy, I think this is a matter of time and education. It didn't start with Asian food. I think that this was an issue. If you go generations back, it started with Italian food as well, and the price of what a bowl of pasta is compared to what it is today, right? This exists in my community as well. We've adopted this in many ways where we feel a certain thing should be a certain way. So we should not have imposter syndrome when it comes to what it takes to produce our own food. So we should be okay to charge what we feel it's worth, and we need consumers to do the same thing.
Listen, I would have never known this, so thank you so much for the education, and you're right, it's going to take years and years of education for everyone to catch up to the reality of this situation and this disparity. Thank you, Trev. So he's going to be back later for part 2 of his conversation with chefs Nuit and Eva about how to move forward from where we are now, and it is a great conversation, so stay tuned for it. Earlier in the show, Chef Trevor shared a conversation he had with fellow chefs about the history of Asian cuisine in Canada and the present issues that have come to light during the pandemic. Now it's about looking forward into the future. Here's what the chefs had to say about where we go from here.
I want to really look to the future. You know, the impact of COVID as it is on our industry alone has been devastating. You know, we keep hearing about this notion of wanting to get back to things the way they were pre-COVID. But I don't necessarily think that that'll serve our community right, particularly the Asian community and the hospitality restaurant industry at large. How do we change the narrative around Asians as a whole and the hospitality business that really is our passion?
Well, we definitely can't go back to how things were. One of the founding pillars of Momofuku is what got us here will not get us there. And true enough, this is definitely one of the topics. The pandemic has exposed flaws in every single system we have. It's not just the hospitality. Everything is being exposed. Workplace abuse, racism, fair wage, equal opportunity, sexism. This is all exposed. And people are stuck at home. And so they are forced to view these issues, to learn about these issues, and to listen. And this is the best chance to educate ourselves. We have to push education. We have to educate everybody before we can demand action. Are we addressing all these issues that are now exposed? People love a good cause, but when we actually get to solutions, are we fighting for them? Are we having uncomfortable conversations with your family, with your friends, with everyone around you?
Okay, we can't get where we're going by doing what got us here. This is so true.